Welcome back to the channel. In today's video, we are going to be ranking all 10 of the films in the Planet of the Apes franchise. So if you watched my last video, the Becoming a Better Cinephile episode on the original Planet of the Apes, I mentioned that my plan initially was to make that video and then watch the rest of the franchise, but I actually was dumb and deleted that whole video that I already recorded, so I had to re-record it a couple weeks after I originally planned on. And so I've actually seen all 10 of the films now. So pretty quickly after immediately doing posting that video, I've already seen all of the 10 videos. So let's just jump straight into it. The original Planet of the Apes film was loosely based on a 1963 novel called Monkey Planet by Pierre Buell. After the success of the original, the studio greenlit 4 sequels over the next 6 years for the original series. The franchise was rebooted in 2001, but due to the film not being well received, no additional sequels were made. 10 years later, the franchise was rebooted again, this time with actors in mocap suits portraying the apes. This month's Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes marks the 4th film in the new franchise, with plans for several more sequels to come. So starting off the list in last place is 2001's Planet of the Apes. After a spectacular crash landing on an uncharted planet, brash astronaut Leo Davidson finds himself trapped in a savage world where talking apes dominate the human race. Desperate to find a way home, Leo must evade the invincible guerrilla army led by ruthless General Thade. The film stars Mark Wahlberg as Captain Leo Davidson, Helena Bonham Carter as Ari, and Tim Roth as General Thade. Planet of the Apes was directed by Tim Burton and was released in 2001. Now, one thing with this franchise that I'm slightly worried about, and I'm probably going to bring it up a couple times as I go on, is I think this franchise, more so than a lot of franchises, I feel like there's almost like a consensus ranking. So maybe this isn't going to be the most exciting video because I feel like there's a lot of films that everyone kind of knows where their spot goes in terms of like their ranking, and this is for the most part it's everyone's least favorite. It does have a couple of things kind of disserve it, things going against it. Obviously, being the one film in the franchise that's kind of just a standalone by itself. Obviously, you have the 5 in the original series, you have the 4 in the new reboot series, and so this is the one that's just kind of by itself. So it's kind of just forgettable in that sense. There's not a whole lot of other characters or multiple films that you're following characters for that to help build your love for this film. That and then it's just a super kind of messy and confusing story. The acting isn't great. There's a lot of things going on here. I will say that kind of the one prop or the one positive that a lot of people do give this film is that the costumes and the makeup design of the apes, because it's kind of more like the practical makeup design that they're doing, and I do think that a lot of people think that it's really good, and I do as well. I do think it is good. I will just say that sometimes it does kind of weird me out and creep me out a little bit with some of the designs and some of the characters that it's a little unappealing looking at for too long for a couple of the characters, and so there's just a whole lot of things going on with this that it's not great. It's kind of just bland. It's kind of forgettable. And then you get to the end of the film, and it tries to call back to the original, tries to do the twist ending that the original does their own spin on it, and it's just a real confusing twist ending. And even if you know that it's coming and you're prepared for some sort of twist, what they do, I think it's good for initial kind of shock value, but then you think about it for a couple seconds and it doesn't make a whole ton of sense. And so, all in all, just a lot of the things with this reboot, this attempted reboot, just didn't really work well. And number 9 for me is Beneath the Planet of the Apes. The sole survivor of an interplanetary rescue mission lands on the planet of the apes and uncovers a horrible secret beneath the surface. The film stars James Franciscus as John Brent, Linda Harrison as Nova, and Maurice Evans as Dr. Zaius. Beneath the Planet of the Apes was directed by Ted Post and was released in 1970. Now, Beneath the Planet of the Apes, it had such a hard task of being the second in the original series. It had the hard task of following up the original film and kind of following the ending of that film. And so I do want to give the film a little bit of a slack, because obviously it wasn't really planned. It's not like the original was planned and then they knew exactly where they were going with all the sequels years in advance. So they're kind of on the fly, kind of come up with a story, kind of come up with a plot for a sequel. And I think they kind of just chose the wrong story. They kind of there's certain factors that were going into it. One of them, obviously, with your lead character from the first film, where his story goes, you think the second film is going to be a continuation of his adventure, but when Charlton Heston didn't really want to be in the second film, you then kind of have to pivot a little bit, and I think, but even then, even if you're pivoting, I still think you could have kind of built off of some of the themes or some of the ideas that were kind of shared at the end in that third act of the original movie. And I think they maybe tried to for a little bit, and then I just don't know if maybe they just didn't think that that was an entertaining story and they wanted to do something different. And so they kind of bring in this whole new element, and it's this, especially the third act, once they get into kind of the subway, um, underground beneath the Planet of the Apes. Once they get into that whole third act, I just was so out of it. It was so out there. It's so random, and I think it's one of those, when you look back at the franchise as a whole, this film I think just stands out in such a way that, like, it doesn't make sense next to any of the other films. That there's certain themes or certain things that are going on in all of these films, but then this film, and I guess a little bit of a spoiler for this film, it decides to go into like a cult of mutants, and like how they're this secret underground society and how they control things. And it's like, it's once you get into that whole third act, we're suddenly not even like, it's not a movie about a planet of apes anymore. It's a whole different kind of like space adventure thing that it becomes a jumbled mess for me. And I think for some people that maybe that is such an out there, such a wild ending to a film that maybe it saves the film for them a little bit and they have fun with kind of the absurd third act. For me personally, I just was kind of put off by it, and I was expecting something better of a follow up to the original, because again, the original was so good. This one also, it's a lot cheaper made than the original, so some of the visual effects that they put in there look awful, and it's, you give the original a lot of credit for looking good for its time, and then the next film lowered the budget and it instantly kind of doesn't look good again. So I just think this film was kind of a mess from start to finish, but especially the finish. Coming in at number 8 is Battle for the Planet of the Apes. The fifth and final episode in the Planet of the Apes series. After the collapse of human civilization, a community of intelligent apes, led by Caesar, lives in harmony with a group of humans. Guerrilla General Aldo tries to cause an ape civil war, and a community of human mutants who live beneath a destroyed city try to conquer those whom they perceive as enemies, all leading to the finale. The film stars Roddy McDowall as Caesar, Claude Akins as Aldo, and Natalie Trundy as Lisa. Battle for the Planet of the Apes was directed by J. Lee Thompson and was released in 1973. And so this film is the grand finale of the original 5 film series. And again, I think it wants to be this grand finale, but I think it's just kind of underwhelming. It's, in my opinion, it's the most forgettable, I think, of pretty much the entire franchise. It's been a couple weeks, and this is the film of the bunch that I feel like I don't remember it as well. It just kind of is meandering oftentimes. It's not as big wide scale as you would think that, kind of the grand finale of a series would be. And I think, again, I guess I don't know for sure. I could have maybe did a little bit more research and try to figure out, but I think what happened with this franchise, the original franchise at least, is you had the original film, great success. All of a sudden, the studio's thinking, oh, we can turn this into like a big franchise, but they didn't have like a grand, a wide view of like, this is the narrative that we're going to tell across 5 stories. This is where we're going. This is where it's leading. And so each film kind of picks up roughly where the last one ended, but it kind of maybe addresses something really quick, and then all of a sudden it's a whole new story and it's going a different direction. And then the next film kind of picks up a little bit where the last one ended, and then it's kind of going a whole new direction. And I think that that's kind of just what happened over and over again, is each film was just kind of solely focused on telling its own story. It wasn't really setting anything up for future films. And so when you get to this film, you get to this big finale, and you're expecting something that's, 4 films paying off here in this finale, and all of a sudden it's just another entry, and it doesn't quite, you know for me personally, it didn't quite capture me. It wasn't quite as investing as I was hoping it would be. And maybe that's a thing that maybe I'll learn, that going back, and if I watch franchises of older franchises, maybe that's kind of just how they all were. Is it's, maybe I'm trained in a way now of kind of, I guess, the MCU brain, if you will, of like, here every film needs to be leading into something else, and there needs to be a bigger plan, than as opposed to just here's one movie, and you can kind of just pick and watch them. So maybe that's something I'll discover as I kind of watch more some older films, is just kind of see if that is kind of just how films were back then. But then at the same time, I mean, I think you can have, like, if you just look at the new series, the four films now, in the new Planet of the Apes franchise, this reboot series, is, even though it's not necessarily like they're all leading to something, it's a continuation of a story. The story continues over, at least for the original trilogy of the new series, for those three Caesar films, it all, like, the story is connected. It's all, it leads to the same, and it's leading to an epic finale, but it's just, for me, I didn't feel like the original series, this film, it just ultimately just didn't quite reach that level for me, so I just was a little disappointed with this one. At number 7 is Conquest of the Planet of the Apes. In a futuristic world that has embraced ape slavery, a chimpanzee named Caesar resurfaces after almost 20 years of hiding from the authorities and prepares for a revolt against humanity. The film stars Roddy McDowall as Caesar, Don Murray as Governor Breck, and Ricardo Montalban as Armando. Conquest of the Planet of the Apes was directed by J. Lee Thompson and was released in 1972. Now, Conquest of the Planet of the Apes, it's the fourth film in the original franchise, and this one, I think it gets kind of some extra credit from me because it's kind of the first that becomes kind of a big humans versus apes story. And again, if you watched my last video where I was talking about the original film, I was talking about how I thought that's just what this entire franchise was humans versus apes, and it's just a dumb battle movie, and there wasn't a lot going into it. And then when I was watching the series, you get through the first three films, and it's very much. I guess the second film, Beneath the Planet of the Apes, kind of has some elements of like apes versus humans, and I guess they all kind of have little bits sprinkled here, but this is the first one. Conquest of the Planet of the Apes is the first one that has kind of a big battle, a big action sequence of really a bunch of apes versus a bunch of humans, and we're starting a war, and like this is where the franchise is going, and so I do think it kind of gets some credit for that, but I think it also gets credit in the sense that it's earned. It's not like it's one of those things where it's just like we're just doing this now. Over the course of what's happened through the first three films, you can see where we've led to this point, and you understand the characters, you understand the apes, you understand Caesar, the way that he and his people have been treated. You understand where this anger and this frustration, where it's all building to this point. And so I think even though once it now kind of has turned into this big battle movie, I think it's earned to the point that I think it's a good thing. And I should mention that once we get to this point in the list, the previous three films that I've talked about, I don't particularly enjoy those. Once we get from here down, I genuinely like to love all of the rest of these movies in this franchise, and so from here on, I think they're all really good films. And so this one being kind of the first one that implements, again, that the kind of the more battle, the fighting between the two sides, I think it has a kind of just a little bit special place in the rankings, and I enjoy that. That's where once we'd earned that point, once we've gotten to that point in the story, I do like that that's the way that the story went. At number 6 is Escape from the Planet of the Apes. The world is shocked by the appearance of three talking chimpanzees who arrived mysteriously in a spacecraft. Intrigued by their intelligence, humans use them for research, until the apes attempt to escape. The film stars Roddy McDowall as Cornelius, Kim Hunter as Zira, and Bradford Dillman as Dr. Lewis Dixon. Escape from the Planet of the Apes was directed by Don Taylor and was released in 1971. This is the third film in the original series, and while I didn't initially love the setup, kind of the opening act of how we're setting up the story, I didn't love that, and it's not really explained, and it doesn't make sense. So initially I was watching it and I was thinking like, oh, I'm not gonna like this. This is dumb. This is bad. But once you get past how the story sets up, once you get to just the rest of the story, it is a good story from there on. So if you're able to kind of just overlook how we got to that point, just the quick little, setup of the film, once you ignore that and you just watch the rest of the film, I do think it is very enjoyable for me, especially. I really loved finally after, kind of following Zira and Cornelius through they're mainly the first film, but they're kind of in the second film as well, seeing how they interact with the human characters in the first couple films, that there's a whole lot more to their story that's not being told. And so I love that once we get to 3, we're getting a little bit more of their story. So I really like that idea of shifting after, you kind of had your human characters, not coming back for the sequels after the first two, to kind of pivot to that point of having, now we're going to follow the main two chimpanzees, are kind of the good guy chimpanzees, the protagonist chimpanzees that we're following from the first couple films, now to follow their story, get to learn them, who they are a little bit more. I do think that that was a smart decision, and I think it worked really well. And ultimately, I think it was just kind of a fun, it's kind of a reverse of the original film, right? Of the original film, you drop a human into a planet full of apes, and it's a fish out of water story. You see how they react to that. Now you've got apes in a world run by humans, and now it's a fish out of story for them. And so it's kind of just like an opposite of the first, where you just kind of get to see how both sides interact by being dropped off into a planet that's where they're not they're the primitive species. And so I do think that it was an interesting idea. I think it works really well. I think the ending is heartbreaking. A lot of this franchise has really sad and kind of twist endings, or just again just sad endings. I do think this falls in that category, but I do think it was still a good ending. And again, it's just one of those. I just love the decision of what they decided to do. I just don't love the initial setup of how they decided to do it, if that makes sense. Coming in at number 5 for me is Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes. Several generations in the future, following Caesar's reign, apes are now the dominant species and live harmoniously while humans have been reduced to living in the shadows. As a new tyrannical ape leader builds his empire, one young ape undertakes a harrowing journey that will cause him to question all that he has known about the past and to make choices that will define a future for apes and humans alike. The film stars Owen Teague as Noah, Freya Allen as May, and Kevin Durand as Proximus Caesar. Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes was directed by Wes Ball and was released in 2024. So now here we're getting into the kind of the new franchise. Now that we're going to have this is the first entry in the new franchise, the most recent film, obviously coming out this month. In this film, it takes place 300 years after the events of the original. It's hard to describe the original reboot trilogy, the Caesar trilogy of this franchise. So it takes like 300 years after, and so we're meeting a whole new cast of characters, a whole bunch of new apes, and it's kind of an interesting story of kind of seeing the kind of just their relationship, or like what they know about Caesar, what they know about his teachings, and you can see how some apes use it for good, some apes use his teachings for bad, and so it's kind of this interesting dynamic. I will say with Rise of the Planet of the Apes, with it being the newest film that's only been in theaters for a couple weeks now, I don't want to really say too much more about the film. I encourage you to go see it. If you're interested in just kind of like my rating, my initial first watch rating, I give it like a 4 out of 5 stars. But yeah, so it's a recommendation for me if you haven't seen it. Especially, for me, I was able to see it in IMAX, and just seeing, it blown up on the biggest screen possible. It's just a beautiful, breathtaking film. And so, again, I love the new reboot trilogy of this so much, and so I highly recommend you go seeing this in theaters if you haven't yet. Coming in at number 4 is Rise of the Planet of the Apes. Scientist Will Rodman is determined to find a cure for Alzheimer's, the disease which has slowly consumed his father. Will feels certain he is close to a breakthrough and tests his latest serum on apes, noticing dramatic increases in intelligence and brain activity in the primitive subjects, especially Caesar, his pet chimpanzee. The film stars Andy Serkis as Caesar, James Franco as Will Rodman, and Frida Pinto as Caroline Arana. Rise of the Planet of the Apes was directed by Rupert Wyatt and was released in 2011. So here we have the original of the new reboot trilogy. Again, it's kind of complicated to talk about. If you just take off Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes, I'm going to refer to this probably as like the Caesar trilogy, the reboot trilogy. And this is the first film in that. And this is maybe going to seem like a weird comparison to some, but maybe not to others. Maybe a lot of people kind of feel this way. I'm not sure, but I kind of compare this trilogy a lot to Christopher Nolan's Batman trilogy, in the sense that, again, all three great films, they all work really well. I think the way that it's kind of similar is you have this first film in the reboot trilogy where it's kind of your more introduction to the story, and it's kind of more world building. And once you get into the second half, once you get into the third act, obviously stuff's happening, and you do get a captivating and a fulfilling story. But a lot of the early parts of the film are just kind of building the characters and setting up everything. And this is what I talk about with this franchise. I think that from start to finish of this trilogy, they knew exactly where they were going. They knew where this story was heading. They knew the different things, the different elements that they were going to add to the character of, now we're going to add, maybe he has some trust issues here because of this. Maybe he has some anger issues because of this. Maybe, he's been hurt this way or whatever, and so you add these little bit of character plot points here in this film that come back and or just continue to grow as the film goes on. And so I think that for that reason, this film does a lot for setting up the entire trilogy as a whole, where again, it's creating this character that we've grown to love throughout this trilogy. I just think that for that specific reason, because it's a little bit more set up as opposed to the payoff of the third film, I think for that reason, that's why it's the lowest on my in terms of the Caesar trilogy, the reboot trilogy. It's my lowest of the three, but again, I still love it, and that's why it finds itself all the way up at number 4 on my list. And then coming in at number 3 is War for the Planet of the Apes. Caesar and his apes are forced into a deadly conflict with an army of humans led by a ruthless colonel. After the apes suffer unimaginable losses, Caesar wrestles with his darker instincts and begins his own mythic quest to avenge his kind. As the journey finally brings them face to face, Caesar and the colonel are pitted against each other in an epic battle that will determine the fate of both of their species and the future of the planet. The film stars Andy Serkis as Caesar, Woody Harrelson as the colonel, and Karen Konoval as Maurice. War for the Planet of the Apes was directed by Matt Reeves and was released in 2017. And just like I was mentioning with the original of this trilogy, where that one's kind of a little bit more of the setup, and then you have the middle film that's kind of just really just the story. You then get to this third one, War for the Planet of the Apes, which is kind of the payoff, and so it's kind of where everything in the first two movies was leading to this film. And I think they do such an excellent job in this film of making making Caesar kind of question himself. There's a lot of times in this where he is questioning who he is, kind of what his role is. Is he the hero that he thinks he is? He kind of has that reflective. There's the one scene specifically where he because he's kind of wrestling early in the film of whether he's too much like Koba, kind of the villain of the previous movie that we'll talk about here in a couple minutes, where he's kind of wrestling, is he too much like that character? And then kind of the realization that, in that third act where he's like, I am no better than Koba. Like, I am the same as, the villain from the last film. Like, I am the same, but, maybe, am I justifying it differently than the way he was justifying it? And so it's kind of this interesting, like, he's a very flawed character who, we look at him, he has this, like, these rules or these laws that he lives by, but he's realizing sometimes you have to break rules, or sometimes you have to kind of, based on, how you're feeling or kind of the things that you're going through. Again, I talked a little bit about some of his anger issues where he's making some of these snap decisions based off of his anger, and all of a sudden you're realizing like, oh, this is just, we're following a really flawed character who means good, but there at times he's doing things that don't always align with what he believes, what his his philosophies that he's trying to, that he was teaching the other apes are. And so it really is just this incredible, captivating story that I think, again, two films that were leading up to the events of this film. And so it's such a rewarding and a grand finale then to the Caesar trilogy, in the sense that, I talk about for Battle of the Planet of the Apes. Again, I get the names mixed up all the time, but the original finale of the original series, where it kind of just felt like it wasn't really going out on this grand epic note, this one absolutely is. It builds up to this moment, and the moment delivers, and it really, for me, this what just solidifies this as, my second favorite in the Caesar trilogy, and why it's, again, just an amazing film. So I'm putting that here at number 3. Coming in at number 2 for me is Planet of the Apes. A U.S. spaceship lands on a desolate planet, stranding astronaut Taylor in a world dominated by apes 2,000 years into the future, who use a primitive race of humans for experimentation and sport. Soon Taylor finds himself among the hunted, and his life in the hands of a benevolent chimpanzee scientist. The film stars Charlton Heston as George Taylor, Roddy McDowall as Cornelius, and Kim Hunter as Zira. Planet of the Apes was directed by Franklin J. Schaffner and was released in 1968. So coming in all the way at number 2 for me, this is where I have the original Planet of the Apes. And I mentioned that I mentioned at the beginning of this video that I think this franchise kind of is almost consensus. It's kind of chalk. A lot of people kind of have the same ranking, because I think it's kind of clear that there's different levels to how the quality of some of the films. I think the original Planet of the Apes is maybe the one that, based on who you're talking to, where it kind of can slide around a lot of different places. It's undoubtedly the best of the original series, but it kind of is just, where do you place it in terms of the the Caesar trilogy, the reboot films. For me, I'm putting it all the way up at number two because again, I was just so blown away by how good it was. Again, not just because of the time that it was made, but just in terms of I just did not understand that I was going to get a story that was as deep as it was. And so for me, I'm going to put it all the way up at number two. I'm not going to talk a whole lot about it. If you're interested in kind of more of my thoughts on this film, the original Planet of the Apes film, I do have my last video on this channel is my Becoming a Better Cinephile video kind of review of that. So it's going to be a way more in-depth review of that. So I recommend checking that out if you're interested. And coming in at number one for me is Dawn of the Planet of the Apes. A group of scientists in San Francisco struggle to stay alive in the aftermath of a plague that is wiping out humanity, while Caesar tries to maintain dominance over his community of intelligent apes. The film stars Andy Serkis as Caesar, Jason Clarke as Malcolm, and Toby Kebbell as Koba. Dawn of the Planet of the Apes was directed by Matt Reeves and was released in 2014. So again, I kind of just compared the Caesar trilogy to Christopher Nolan's Batman trilogy, and I think that the comparison almost just works perfectly in the sense that you have Batman Begins and Rise of the Planet of the Apes as kind of the setup films for the character. You then have Dawn of the Planet of the Apes and The Dark Knight that kind of are just like the masterpieces of the franchise as like the second films. And then you have The Dark Knight Rises and War for the Planet of the Apes as kind of the conclusion of everything that's been building up over a three-film trilogy. And so I think, in a way, it works creepily well for me, at least in my brain. That's the way that I like him. The comparison I have for the Caesar reboot trilogy, and again, I think part of the reason that makes it work so well for Dawn of the Planet of the Apes and The Dark Knight, why they're so comparable, is again the heroes, the protagonists, their philosophies, everything that's been building to that point. So you love these characters, and then in both of the films, you drop in an all-time villain. You drop in one of just greatest villains. In The Dark Knight, you're dropping in Joker in kind of a sense of he's just kind of pure chaos, and you don't know exactly what he's doing. And here you have Koba, who I guess in a sense he's kind of chaotic and kind of has that, but he's more in the sense of like you understand his character because he's introduced kind of toward the end of the first film, of Rise of the Planet of the Apes. You understand a little bit what he's gone through. You understand his feelings, his thoughts, his relationship to humans, and after what they've done to him. And so you understand his frustration and you understand where he comes from in this film. Obviously, you don't agree with a lot of all the things that he does, or you don't always agree with how far he takes some things and kind of how he starts turning on, kind of turns on his own, turns on the apes, turns against, the chimpanzees. He becomes kind of the antagonist to not just the humans characters, but the antagonist to the ape characters as well. And so, obviously, you don't agree with where he goes, but you do understand a lot of his character. And I think that that's what makes him so compelling of a villain. That's what makes him so, just a great character. And I think I've talked about this now with the Joker, and then with Anton Chigurh and No Country for Old Men, which is another film that I just rewatched, or I watched for the first time in part of my Becoming a Better Cinephile series. I talk about those two as being like some of the greatest villains of cinema history. I think Koba is right there with them. I think he is up there, and I think it's interesting that all three of those villains are kind of all taking place around the same time, kind of like the mid-teens, within the last decade or so. But I guess the Dark Knight is a little bit older, but they're all kind of within that same decade era. But they're all again are just great villains, and I think that that's what makes, especially an action adventure film like this, that's what makes it so good, is because you love your protagonist, but you also love the character of the villain. You don't obviously love all of what they're doing, but they provide such a intense, and they bring such a great element to the film that you're watching. And so you just throw all of those elements together. Everything that's going on in Dawn of the Planet of the Apes from start to finish is just captivating. I didn't love all of the human characters in Rise of the Planet of the Apes, because again, they're the majority of the characters, and so it's like obviously some of the characters are going to be hit and miss here and there. But in this film, you've kind of the apes are starting to take over. There's less human characters, so the human characters that there are, I loved what all of them were bringing to the film. I loved kind of the relationship that they have with the apes, what is happening in the world, where they've kind of, again, the description talks about them kind of retreating to the shadows. They're kind of more, they're starting to kind of peel back. They don't really have the power, so they're all kind of in these little communities, and it's just an interesting relationship that's being developed in this film. And again, it makes I love all the human characters. I love the ape characters. I just love everything that's going into this. All the characterization for everyone is done so well, and then just on top of it, it's an epic adventure movie, and it's just grand in scale. And for me, it's just from start to finish, everything about it. I just love this film, and that's why it's number one on my list. And that's it. That is all 10 films in the Planet of the Apes franchise ranked. Let me know down below in the comments what your ranking of the franchise is, what your favorites of the franchise are, what your least favorites are. I'm curious to see because, like I mentioned a couple times in this video, I think there's almost like a little bit of a consensus ranking. So I'm interested to see if you guys have kind of the same ranking or the same idea. And then just let me know down below in the comments as well if you like this idea of me just kind of after I binge a whole series, ranking the series at the end. Again, I haven't done it with some of the series because there's some of the franchises I've watched I just haven't loved as much. Like as much as I love Planet of the Apes, I truly was shocked at how much I loved this franchise, and so that's why I wanted to really kind of do an extra video of just ranking the whole franchise, so I get an opportunity to talk a little bit about each of the films in the franchise. Because again, I was just blown away by how much I loved it. It just seemed like coming into it, I just thought that like, oh, it's just a dumb humans versus monkeys movie, and it's not going to be very good. And then I'd heard everyone kind of talking about how good especially the Caesar trilogy is, like how good the new films are, and I still just didn't like. I didn't believe it. I didn't buy in the hype, and I regret, like looking back now, I kind of regret that. I wish I was kind of more involved with this franchise as it was, as the Caesar trilogy was happening. But I'm 100% invested now, and so for however many films they go, I think I saw a quote from the director of the Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes, or I can't remember who, maybe it was a producer, I don't remember who exactly it was, but they were talking about how they have like a 9 film series planned, and so they're at film 4, so they still, if in a perfect world for them, if they're able to keep making the way all the films that they want to, they've got 5 more films coming. And so it's just one of those franchises that I'm glad I've got in now. I wish I was in a little bit earlier, but I am in now, and I'm going to be invested in every film that comes out the rest of the way because this franchise is just so good. So again, just let me know down below in the comments your thoughts on the overall franchise, your rankings as well, and thank you so much for watching this video, and have a great day.